Welcome to Season 7 of my podcast, Between Us, Stories of Unconscious Bias. This season, I speak to people in Mexico, America, Ireland, Sri Lanka, India, and the UK. I have stories that I'm sure will resonate with anyone, anywhere in the world. For example, how to be more confident, or how are we seen differently in the country of our birth, only because we don't look like everyone else. I also hear stories that are chilling, and I'm moved at how the speaker found the inner resilience to overcome their challenges. I hear stories of music, religion, and so much more. I hope you take away as much as I have when hearing these stories. Thank you so much for listening. I'd like to introduce Nicola Horlick. Nicola graduated from the Balliol College in Oxford with a degree in Jurisprudence. Nicola then later joined SG Warburg as a graduate trainee in 1983. She was initially placed in the asset management division, where she stayed for the following 8 years, becoming a director at the young age of 28. In 1991, she moved to Morgan Grenfell Asset Management and was made managing director of the UK investment division in 1992. So as you can see, Nicola seems to run before she can walk. In 1997, Nicola was asked to set up a UK investment business for SocGen, the French bank, with the aim of accumulating 5 billion of funds under management over the following 5 years. The business was launched in 1998, and guess what? After 2 years, the target had been reached and funds under management reached 7 billion a year later. In 2013, she founded Money & Co, a peer-to-peer lending platform, where she still remains CEO today. And Nicola lives in London in the United Kingdom. But it was around 1998 that I first heard of Nicola. She was called superwoman in the media for balancing a high-flying finance career alongside bringing up 6 children. Yes, you heard me right, 6 children. For those of you living in London at that time, you were sure to remember stories about Nicola Horlick. At that time, I too was a mother of 3 young children and trying to juggle everything. And I remember thinking that the title Superwoman really did stick, and that Nicola looked like she was having her cake and eating it too, to such a successful degree. I thought 3 children were challenging enough, but 6? So I reached out to Nicola for this interview because I wanted to explore what unconscious biases Nicola may have had all those years ago and what she has learned along the way. Welcome, Nicola. Thank you so much for joining me to share your stories of unconscious bias.
Thank you.
So, unconscious bias, let's just kind of explore those 2 words first before we hear your stories. What do they mean to you?
Well, they mean being biased without realizing it. And, I suppose people use that term mostly with regard to gender issues and recruitment issues. The idea that you go into a panel, an interview with a panel, and they hire more men than women, even though you've got some very good female candidates. I remember actually once a headhunter saying to me when I was saying I just can't understand why there aren't more women on boards. And she said, well, a lot of the men that I speak to find women to be very shrill. I was really horrified that a woman was saying that to me because she didn't seem to disagree. So, that's what I understand by unconscious bias. People may say, we're trying, we're giving women an equal opportunity here, but in the end, they still hire a man.
And very shrill. It makes me laugh, really, because you're so right. I remember somebody saying that of Kamala Harris, who was then senator at the time. And as we now know, she's vice president of the United States. And she was chairing a select affairs committee. And the 2 men who were by her side suggested that she was too aggressive and too shrill. It's interesting, isn't it, how these unconscious biases, no matter where you are and what level of seniority you may be at, they still kind of rear their ugly head. But what about you, Nicola? Because, you've had an incredible life, and certainly from some people's perspective, an extremely successful life. But I'm sure you have stories that you could share with us about your own unconscious biases and things you've learned along the way.
Well, I've always tried very, very hard not to have any unconscious biases. So, for example, I've always felt when I've been working in big banks that graduate recruitment was very, very important because it's, the future of the business. So I used to just set myself targets. I used to say, I am going to hire half girls and half boys. We're hiring 10 people, we're going to have 5 girls, 5 boys. And I would try and rigidly stick to that to try and overcome any unconscious bias. Because I suppose there's a risk I could have gone the other way and hired all girls. And that's just as bad in some ways, because then you're discriminating against guys. So,
and are we talking about a few years ago? Are you talking about not before the Me Too movement?
No, this was many years ago. Because
that's what I thought.
I've been running, boutique fund management businesses and so on since 2004. So prior to that, I was doing, large recruitment operations. And when we set up SocGen's business, we hired 180 people in 18 months. Which is quite extraordinary. We did a lot of interviewing. I mean, in that instance, when you're setting a fund management business up from scratch, I mean, gendered, we couldn't really take account of that. We had to get the best person for the job and really fast because we were growing so quickly. So, but with things like graduate recruitment, where it was a bit more of an orchestrated thing and you had a certain number of slots, that was easier to say. Let's have half boys and half girls. One thing, by the way, that really used to annoy me was if I hired 5 guys and 5 girls, by 3 years later, most of the girls will have left. And I used to do these exit interviews and say, well, why is it that you don't want to work in fund management or in the city? And, I'm afraid it just was an environment that a lot of them didn't like. And you can't make people do something if they don't want to do it. So, they were doing it for a couple of years and then going off into journalism or PR or headhunting or things where there were more women, and they didn't necessarily want to stay in the city. They didn't enjoy it. So I think maybe it's not possible to, in some industries, to have 50-50. I've got a daughter at the moment who's training to be a surgeon, and she wants to be an orthopedic surgeon. And she told me the other day that only 3% of orthopedic surgeons are women. I mean, that's really a very low number, isn't it? And she said it's an area where they're generally rugby players and heavy drinkers. And she's not a rugby player and not a heavy drinker. So, so there are just going to be, I think, some areas where it's not so much about unconscious bias with the people who are doing the recruitment, but that the people who are being recruited don't like that particular area and don't want to operate in it. And
but then it becomes a bit like wish-fulfilling prophecy, though, doesn't it, Nicola? Because we don't reinvent the wheel. We just keep doing same old. Or if you're a surgeon, there's no point applying if you're a woman, or if you're I'm trying to think of something else. What you do for a living, for example. Heading up a fund management company. Something to do with money, a stockbroking firm.
Yeah, but there will always
instinctively you'd think they're men, but there you are, you're a woman breaking the mold.
Yeah, that's right. And there will always be people like me and my daughter who sort of relish the idea of being a woman in a man's world. But there are an awful lot of other women who don't relish it and would rather not. And that's the thing. And so we're never, if being realistic about it, we're never going to have half the people in the city being women. I mean,
so let's go back to your early days, Nicola. You are where you are now, continuing to be certainly successful within the finance industry. But what about the beginning? When you were 28, when you were already heading up a company and dealing with money. So let's go back to those days. What kind of self-belief or unconscious biases did you have those days that allowed you to kind of do what you do?
I was very, very lucky because I happened to work for a bank, which was a true meritocracy. And it was very interesting during the interview process because I had 3 final interviews at 3 what were called merchant banks in those days. And 2 of them were very old institutions that have been going for 250 years. And one of them had been founded post-war by a Jewish refugee. So I went to these interviews, and at the other 2 interviews, there were 9 guys and me. And they'd all been to Eton and Winchester, and we had all been to Oxford and Cambridge. And then I went to Warburg's, and it was a mixture of men and women, people from all over the world. Some had done just a a bachelor's degree, some had done postgraduate studies, some had done MBAs. So it was a range of different people with different educational experiences. And just from the interview process, I could see why it was that Warburg's, which had only been founded post-war, was regarded as the number one merchant bank in the City of London, ahead of these very, very old institutions. And so when I was offered a job by Warburg's, I was completely over the moon, because I thought, this organisation is a true meritocracy, and I have a chance, at least, if I work hard enough and I try hard enough, of actually being recognised. Because even at that early age, I sort of realised that life was going to be tough as a woman. And so luckily, I was right. It was a true meritocracy. I did work really hard. I did do really well, and they recognised that and promoted me very, very quickly. And I ended up being a director at the age of 28. So I was, and then after that, I was headhunted by another bank, which, unlike Warburg's, which was doing brilliantly well, was having a major issue with its fund management business, which was in decline, and they wanted me to go there and help turn it around.
Sort them out. But what you said earlier on about Warburg's is also very interesting, because, we're talking about unconscious bias and people's unconscious biases or their narrative. Our life experiences influence us in ways that we don't realize. And I'm thinking of this Jewish refugee post-war. We don't know the person's story. I don't know the person's story, perhaps you do, who would have had enormous challenges during World War II. And yet, despite that, managed to start this, what we call a merchant bank. And therefore, in a strange sort of way, that person is probably saying instinctively, I struggled to get where I did. So I want to make sure that I give an equal level playing field to everyone. So what you get is what you give, don't you think?
Yeah, that's right. So he was called Sigmund Warburg, and that's quite right. He did create an incredibly interesting, way ahead of its time organisation, where women were given far more opportunity than they were anywhere else in the city at the time. And there were a number of senior women there already when I got there, so they acted as role models for me. And I thought, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And so I did,
And that in itself, we're talking about the mid-80s. And the mid-80s in London is not the way 2022 London is. And it would have been incredible, really. But let's come back to you, Nicola, and sort of your stories of things that happened in your life instinctively. I mean, you were lucky, so you got this job. But what about you and your own unconscious biases growing up, positive or negative? Because the word bias is not necessarily negative. We know about the gender and race and religion and homophobia. Those are kind of discriminatory biases. But could you share a different kind of story with us to hone the point?
Well, I think it's just human nature that you're going to have biases. I think people tend to migrate towards people who have similar backgrounds, whether it's social or educational. And my very strong belief is that the best teams, the ones that really succeed, are the ones that are diverse. And I don't just mean in terms of ethnicity, which is how people tend to think of it, but I also mean in terms of gender and also social background. And I've always said to the people who I work with, I don't expect you to be best mates and, be with each other every weekend or go on holiday together. In order to really succeed and to have true creativity, we need a bit of tension. And as long as that tension doesn't get to be so great that the whole thing falls apart, that's what you need in order to succeed. And I truly believe that that is the case. And so I've always tried to build teams that are not just a whole lot of Nicola clones, but are an interesting group of people from lots of different backgrounds. So, for example, a really good example would be a friend of mine had a brother-in-law who had been to Oxford and studied music. And he then decided that he was going to be a tenor. And he had a very good singing voice. And indeed, he did get, some roles in some operas with various opera companies in the UK. But he got sort of some way into his career, and then he thought very long and hard, and he said to himself, I have a great voice, but I don't have a powerful enough voice really to be a great tenor, and I don't want to settle for being second best. So I'm actually going to give up music and I'm going to look for another career. So he was now 30. So his brother-in-law wrote to me and said, look, this guy, he's very charming, wonderful musician. He's decided he wants to go into financial services. He's written 60 letters and not a single one of the people he's written to has replied, which apart from being very rude is extremely demoralizing. Is there any way that you could organize an internship? Strange to have an intern age 30, but could you organize an internship for him for a couple of months, just so he's got something to put on his CV, so that when he then writes to people, they might reply? So I said, of course, that I'd be delighted to have him for a couple of months. So anyway, he arrives and we get him to do some reports and do some analysis of companies, and we teach him a bit about how to analyze accounts and so on and so forth. And at the end of the 2 months, I had found, when I first told my team that this guy was coming, that they were all extremely anti him coming because he was a musician and they couldn't see how he could possibly be of any use to us. But at the end of the 2 months, they were all begging me to keep him. They said, we've got to offer him a full-time job. This guy is absolutely fantastic. I then said to him, look, you know, you're 30, but you don't really know enough. So we're going to have to treat you like a graduate trainee, and we're going to have to put you in with all the 21 and 22-year-olds, and you're basically going to be starting at the beginning. He said, I don't care, I'm willing to do it. And so he did, and he became one of my best fund managers. Everybody adored him, and he went on to have a very long and successful career in financial services. So that wasn't me. I mean, I was just trying to do a favor for a friend in many ways by allowing him to be an intern. But what I was slightly surprised by was the antipathy towards him when he first arrived, because he was a musician, and this feeling amongst the team that this was ridiculous and that I was being ridiculous. And I was saying, it's only for 2 months. Don't be so mean. Just let this guy come and see.
Because I think it's also so much about people wanting to feel safe, don't you think, Nicola? We know that these guys are coming into our office, they have such and such skills, such and such experience, we'll all work together, all hunky-dory. And then there's this random guy who comes in, who doesn't know anything about what we do, and sees himself as a musician, as a tenor. I mean, people start feeling uncomfortable, they don't like their boat being rocked. I think that's the instinct. And your colleagues were not unusual in responding the way they did, I don't think. It's just how it is, isn't it?
Going back to what I said about diversity, diversity comes in many forms. And one of those forms is not having everybody going down the same funnel, doing their GCSEs, doing their A-levels in the UK, doing a degree, going and doing internships during their holidays, going on the milk round and choosing a bank to work in. And, it's all very narrow, isn't it? And if actually somebody's been a professional musician for a number of years, they've had all sorts of adversity to overcome. And having different life experiences really adds to a team and to a business in terms of...
But then what is your story, Nicola, where you instinctively want to the status quo? And I'm not talking about today, I'm talking about when you were 25, when you were 35. You very instinctively did not take that. Yes, you went to Oxford. Yes, you got into a banking job. Yes, you did well. But you also then had kids. A lot of people, a lot of women then and today might compromise one for the other. But you chose not to. You're going to have your cake and eat it too. I'm going to deliberately choose those words. But what is it? I mean, I want to know more about you, Nicola Horlick, the person.
I've always been anti-establishment, I suppose. I've always been someone who has challenged the system and
but how come?
To disrupt. I think it's partly just my personality, that's just how
Is it your parenting, would you say?
Yeah.
Something that happened when you were 10 years old? I don't know, I'm making it up.
Well, it's partly that. It's partly that I had a father who really believed in me and told me that I could do anything that I wanted. And, we lived in Cheshire, near Chester, and I was sent to a small girls' private prep school where they were basically teaching flower arranging and knitting. And my brother was sent to the boys' prep school down the road where they were learning Latin, Greek, and science. And after a year or so, my father said, I really don't like the fact that my daughter isn't being taught properly compared to my son. And my brother's school had started to take a few sisters, not very many, just literally a small handful of sisters. And so my father said, well, actually, I think you should go to this boys' school. So he took me away from the girls' school and sent me to the boys' school, where instead of learning flower arranging and knitting, I then learnt Latin, Greek, and science. And, that changed my life forever, really. First of all, it opened my horizons academically, but it also meant that because I was in a boys' school, because I was playing cricket and football and not playing netball or hockey, I got used to being in a male-dominated environment. I learned how to deal with boys from a very early age. And, I suppose that is one of the reasons why I've always, when I went to Oxford, I was the first year of women in my college, Balliol College. So it's the first year of women. There were 23 women and 550 guys. But it didn't faze me at all because I was used to that environment. When I got to the city, I wasn't fazed at all because I was used to being in a male-dominated environment. So I think my experience of being at a boys' prep school from the age of 6 to the age of 12 has moulded my life, my professional life, to a very large degree.
Isn't it, Nicola? Because this early years, the age of 6 to 12, they're such crucial years. And when we're growing up, we just take our growing up for granted. And your growing up was what it was. There you were amongst, a bunch of boys doing what people would, certainly those days, and even today to a great degree, called boy stuff. And this was, you're talking about sort of mid-70s. And you just absorbed it. You didn't feel uncomfortable. You were included. And that automatically that's really our unconscious bias. You see, that's the kind of stories that I want our listeners to also take. That these early years and how we're influenced can impact us.
I'm not intimidated by large numbers of men because that's what I'm used to. So
yes, exactly. Yeah. Could you share another story, Nicola?
Yeah, another story I thought I'd tell you is about a friend of mine who set up what I thought was a very clever business at the time. So this was when hedge funds first became a huge thing. And everybody was desperate to put money into hedge funds. This is institutional investors. And there simply weren't enough hedge funds. And so this friend of mine thought, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a number of female fund managers who have a really good track record and suggest to them that they set up a hedge fund and then provide a platform through which people can access these female-run hedge funds. So, and this was all happening on Wall Street. So she had worked at one of the major banks at Morgan Stanley. She had this idea. She had enough money of her own to sort of set it all up and so on. And she found these really successful female fund managers, got them to set up hedge funds and then helped to promote them. And she also got a study written by a professor at Harvard analysing investment skills. And one of the things that he said was that, the thing about women is that it's a bit tortoise and hare, that you will have the young guy who's a hedge fund manager and he will have incredibly volatile performance. So year 1 is up 20%, year 2 is down 15%, year 3 is up 30%, whereas the woman will just add a bit of value all the time. And at the end, you probably find the woman's a bit ahead of the guy. So there's definitely a different mentality. And I've observed that anecdotally when I've been managing teams of fund managers, that women are inherently more cautious. So this friend of mine was promoting this idea and she found it extraordinary because she said that she very quickly realized that if you had a guy out there promoting his hedge fund and a woman, and they had identical performance records, that the guy would come back with 2 billion and the girl would come back with 200 million if she was lucky. And that she particularly noticed a bias against the female investors from females making decisions. And she couldn't understand it. And she talked to some of them after the event and said, you selected that guy who manages this hedge fund with a very similar record to this woman that I introduced you to, but you went for the guy. Why? And the woman wouldn't really be able to give a coherent reason as to why she'd chosen the guy over the woman. And I think this very much comes back to this idea of, unconscious bias, where for some reason, everybody making decisions about investments is more inclined to trust a male investor than a female investor, probably still to this day. And somehow they just believe they're going to perform better, when in fact...
Which is very unfortunate, isn't it? Because if you're really giving the woman a chance, and the Harvard study has proven that actually in the long term, it's better to actually go with the woman. But of course, people are thinking short term. They're not thinking the big picture, and that really is very unfortunate. And you're right, even today, and we're not talking just hedge fund, Nicola, we're talking about so many different aspects where people look at man and woman and make an assumption that a man would be better at the job. I mean, like your daughter going to be an orthopedic surgeon. It's just the way it is. I mean, and nurses, they assume that women are better at being a nurse than men because it is expected, nurses are expected to show more tenderness and affection and emotion and what we call the touchy-feely stuff.
You're right.
And they don't think the men can do that good enough. So can I have a woman nurse, please? Thank you very much. And there are many men who are outstanding nurses who may not be given the opportunity.
Yeah, that's quite right. I agree. It can go the other way. It can be discriminating against a man in favor of a woman in certain sectors.
But let's think about you, and I'm thinking about me in 1997, 98 with 3 little fellows running around like mad dervishes and trying to hold on a part-time job and juggling many things in the air. And there was Superwoman, as we used to remember you in the media, holding down, not just holding down, doing an extremely successful job, high-flying banking investment job, and 6 children. So tell us a little bit about that, and what kind of self-beliefs did you have, Nicola, that allowed you to just juggle everything?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that my eldest child was diagnosed with leukemia when she was only 2. And so at that stage, I had her and I had one other child. And I think if I hadn't had a sick child, I definitely would have had 3 or 4 children, but I wouldn't have had 6. And that came out of having a very sick child. And I think if you know that you've got a child who may die, your natural inclination is to have more children. And having discussed this with mothers at Great Ormond Street, a lot of people go down that route and end up having more children than they would have otherwise. So I had 5 children. Georgie then died, and then 2 months after she died, I got pregnant with my 6th child, who was born after she died, so 10 months after she died, or 11 months. So I actually ended up grieving and pregnant at the same time. So it was very, very difficult. And, it was very comforting when Benji came out, because he was my little angel, and it really made me feel a lot better to have him to hug. So it wasn't really, it certainly wasn't me saying, I'm going to have 6 children and prove to the world that I can work and have 6 children. It was more to do with Georgie being very sick, and that's why I ended up having so many children. In the meantime, somehow, I don't really know how, I muddled through having a very sick child, because she was diagnosed when she was 2 but died when she was 12. So we had long periods of illness, but we also had periods where she was quite well. So after she was diagnosed initially, she had treatment for a few months, and then went on to maintenance treatment. So it was less onerous. We weren't in hospitals. We were if she got an infection. We would have a period in hospital. But generally speaking, she was quite well. So from the age of 3 to the age of 8, we lived a relatively normal life. But then from the age of 8 to the age of 12, we had terrible traumas and awfulness. And Georgie was extremely sick. And ultimately, the last year of her life, I lived in Great Ormond Street. But, even when you've got a very sick child, they still have to educate the child. So we still had to have teachers and so on. So she would do her schoolwork in the morning, and my office was walking distance from Great Ormond Street. So I would walk down to from Great Ormond Street to my office, work for the morning, and then walk back, by which time Georgie would have finished all her lessons. And I spend the rest of the day working from the hospital whilst interlacing that with reading to her and doing things with her. And then I would sleep in the hospital and do the whole thing the next day. And, what really suffered was my other children, because for a year I was largely separated from them. And there wouldn't have been much point in me going home during the day because they were at school. So it was a very, very difficult time. And somehow we got through it. I don't know how, but ultimately Georgie died. So this is one of the reasons why when people used to refer to me as the woman who had it all, it used to really annoy me. So I wrote a book called "Can You Have It All?" ? And the answer to that is no, because if I don't have Georgie, I don't have it all. So and work is very, very secondary compared to all of that. So so it was an unusual situation. Luckily, it's very rare now for children to die, and we were just the unlucky family who were in that position.
But that's taught you so many things, hasn't it, Nicola? I mean, I wanted to hear the story from you. I mean, I have certainly read about it at the time. And of course, just to respond to the earlier point of having more children because you think you might lose one. Certainly in developing countries, I'm thinking Afghanistan, for example, most families are 6 or 7 children because it's hard and they don't know if all those children will survive.
This is the saying of Victorian families, they
exactly,
would 7 or 8 children and expect 4 of them to die.
Exactly.
They were permanently dressed in black. So we live in an age where child death is extremely rare, fortunately.
Yeah.
And
but this for you though, Nicola, and of course, I appreciate that. Of course, you were not superwoman and you were not having your cake and eating it too. I was, as you know, quite deliberately choosing those words because I wanted the listeners to appreciate that it's actually really hard to have your cake and eat it too. It doesn't work that way. There's life and there's a whole lot going on in everyone's lives that we don't see. We only see the cover of the book. And unless we actually open the book and read the book, we don't know what the content is. And you are very kindly sharing, personal stories in your life from many years ago. But on reflection, though, Nicola, what has this taught you? I mean, how do you manage not just about recruitment or work-based things, but life and living and so on? What kind of stories have you managed to teach yourself over the years?
Well, I mean, it made me very resilient. Because getting through all of that was obviously extremely difficult. And really nothing that life can throw at me now is ever going to be as hard as that. And so, I mean, I think I'm naturally a calm person anyway. But I think having had that very difficult experience of fighting for a child's life and losing that battle has made me realise that there are more important things than, the issue you've got with your business on a particular day. And I just always say, well, there's got to be a way of getting through this. We will find a way. And, I think it's also helped by the fact that I'm naturally an optimistic person and I will always believe that there is a way out. But I think definitely having had a very sick child and having had to deal with all the trauma and horror of the situation, it's made me quite sanguine about things and calmer than most people would be in difficult situations, just because I know there are the worst things that you can face in life.
Very wise. I think I'm going to pause there and allow the listeners to appreciate that here is Nicola Horlick, a very successful businesswoman, and yet someone who has learned to be resilient, because stuff is thrown at all of us, and it is about how we manage it when it is thrown at us. So I appreciate your honesty and your sharing these stories, Nicola. Nicola Horlick, thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Proud to announce that my podcast series is now heard in 104 countries, ranging from Guadeloupe to Iceland, Argentina to Palestine, and even Morocco. It is ranked in the top 3% worldwide. This is clearly a series that connects with people all over the world, and you are one of them. I thank you for listening. I would also like to thank Jack Godfrey for his original music in the closing of each podcast interview. If you like this episode, please do share, rate and review. I am Smitha Tharoor. Until next time.